Slugly was your average slug, living off the rot and decay of the polluted city. As they say, you are what you eat, and slugs are not any different from you or I. But slugs, being at the very bottom of the food chain, are most affected. As the city becomes more poisoned and polluted, the slugs become sicker and increasingly more prone to bad habits, dark thoughts, and generalized fear and anxiety. All of the gods' creatures were suffering at the decline of the city, but none so more than the slugs. Yet things were not always this way. Slugsley himself remembered a time in his youth much different from the harsh reality of the modern city, for he was not always a city slug. He grew up with his slug family in what was once the peaceful countryside. But as more and more of the natural habitat was bulldozed, paved over, and destroyed, Slugsley and his family, like many other creatures, made their way to the cities, searching for another way. The slugs followed trails of rot and decay further into the festering heart of the city, where they made their home among the refuse and the ruins. Slugly found a job with the city as a construction worker to support his family, but they had no insurance and got sicker and sicker. As time went on, rents increased, and they had no access to health care, like most of the other insects, so one by one they died off, leaving Slugly alone as he himself became increasingly sick. Soon afterwards, he was injured on the job and unable to work. Disability payments were not enough. Rent is going up, and there's nowhere to go. He started selling his prescriptions to pay the rent and fund his bad habits, but the prescriptions became more and more expensive and harder to find. With his options limited by his poverty and lack of family, he slid further and further into the abyss. He took more and more drugs, any chemical he could find, hoping for relief from his pain and loneliness, but things only got worse as his addiction spiraled out of control. His paranoia also increased, and eventually he was forced out of his apartment and left, with nowhere to go. The city's a hustle, game of survival. It's a bug-eat-bug world out there, and when the survival game becomes more difficult, we all suffer. But there are rules in the hustle and a pecking order, and slugs are at the bottom of the food chain. Predators abound in the city, and Slugly felt their eyes watching him and sizing him up everywhere he would go. Slugs who are not careful rarely survive. He was out on the streets, and his paranoia continued to grow with each passing day as the streets became more and more crowded and dangerous. As more animals and insects were forced into the streets to compete for space. There's a famine over the land. The animals are hungry. Slugly couldn't take the street life for long, so he sought refuge through employment at a roach motel. After moving to the motel, he became a shut-in. Terrified of the outside world, he rarely left his room, but would watch TV or gaze out the window. Sometimes he would listen to the radio, or was kept awake by the sounds coming from the other rooms in the motel. At least he was not so lonely. He made friends. Bruce, a housefly who was his roommate, and Gary, the crawfish who lived upstairs. They would hang out together and smoke and play dice. Slugsley started having terrible dreams around this time. Death was on his mind. He wasn't feeling well anymore. Even the drugs could no longer help him. He was a sponge in the chemical soup and became more sick and paranoid with each passing day. He felt the cold hands of death coming for him from beyond the grave, and the dreams remained, beckoning him to leave the past behind. He decided he could not go on this way. So he went to hypnotherapy. He bought books on tape, and he played chess to pass the time. He even attended a few AA meetings. Bruce and Gary cleaned up their act as well, and he was beginning to feel better, but he was still haunted by the dreams of death, and often at night, when he could not sleep, he would try to remember his home in the wilderness, which seemed so far away to him now, almost as if it had never existed. Every day Slugsley prayed for a way out. Every day he dreamed. He had never been a religious sort of bugger, but it did not seem so strange to think that perhaps someone or something was listening. He kept hoping for a sign, and one day he got his answer. On the verge of falling asleep, he heard a voice, like the tinkling of bells and the trumpets of angels, and he beheld a glorious vision. "Slugsley, Slugsley." "Yes?" "Wake up, it's time to go." "Time to go where?" "It's time for you to get out of here." "What do you mean? Where am I? Get out of where?" "The city, this awful roach motel, the whole thing. It's over now." "Well, where am I going to go?" "I can't say, but here's your warning. Take your friends with you and leave." Upon waking, Slugsley barely remembered the dream, yet he knew there was a warning. The vision of the glowworm haunted him, yet he could not remember what it had said. The dream remained out of reach, floating through his unconscious. He had let go of the past and many of his bad habits, and yet he felt that something was still not right with the world. So he started saving his pennies and planning an escape route out of the city.